when we begin to have these awarenesses, it allows us to bring the space of listening in differently, which connects us, which is the ultimate goal, is to be connected, even in difficult conversations, even through conflict, is to be connected and to move toward solution, even if that solution is to complete the relationship. All right, welcome back to another episode. You know who I am. I'm Dr. Maisha, and today we're going to talk a little bit about how different people perceive conflict and manage and navigate conflict. And I think this is important because, and I talk about conflict in a lot in organizations and how to manage conflict in a trauma informed environment. But I think a lot of times what people miss about interactions with each other is that they're not the only one in the interaction. And so as I thought about this episode today, and I've been thinking about this topic for a while now, I wanted to bring into the space this idea that when we are in interaction with people, we have to keep in mind their perception of our interaction as much as we are perceiving the interaction. And we need to also remember that our listening is a version of the story. Our listening is a perception of the story. And so when we are thinking about things like communication and difficult conversations and conflict, we have to understand that different personality types navigate and even perceive conflict in different ways. So let's talk about that. First of all, it's important to understand that conflict is neither good nor bad. And I talk about this a lot. It is inevitable. Difficult conversations happen. Sometimes we prepare for them, sometimes they arise spontaneously. And the way we perceive conflict will drive the way we interact with others. So, before we get into personalities and how different personalities perceive conflict, we want to just talk about how the world in general uh, perceives, and we want to talk about the narrative of conflict from the primarily from the way it's portrayed. So, before we get into this idea of how different personalities perceive conflict, we want to first look at how does society portray conflict and what it is. Generally speaking, when we look at media of any type, social media, television, we see conflict as this huge negative thing, and it's traumatizing for a lot of people. We often see difficult conversations as doom and gloom. The reality is that these things happen all the time and every day. And really, it's just a difference of point of view, a difference of opinion. And in conflict, oftentimes you come to an impasse where each person is trying to be heard and get their point of view across. And if there are opposing points of view, sometimes it can arise intense emotions and create intensity in the communication itself. Now, by and large, because we're not really taught formally how to deal with, unless you study conflict management, we're not taught how to navigate conflict in our daily lives. In fact, most of the time we inherit it from the things that we've seen in our household, in our close environments, even in our educational systems. We learn sort of how to navigate conflict inherently and passively, and not as an intentional teaching. And so, for many, depending on how you were socialized, you actually may have had traumatic experience of what conflict is. And so then you have people who avoid conflict, and you also have people who direct. You also have people who are directly. Let me edit this out. You also have people who take difficult conversations and conflict head on, and sometimes even in an aggressive manner. And again, that all depends on how you were socialized to difficult conversations and conflict. But by and large, for some people, for some people, conflict can occur as a threat, and particularly as a threat to one's safety, whether it's psychological or emotional safety, sometimes even as a threat to one's physical safety. And so, how we were socialized to communication in that way will determine how we perceive conflict and whether we perceive it as a threat, which will also drive our interactions. So we can now layer the fact that because of our upbringing, because of our birth luck, because of the environments that we grew up in, that we're all going to be socialized to difficult conversations and conflict in different ways. And you may hear me distinguishing conflict from difficult conversations because not all difficult conversations lead to conflict. Not all difficult conversations lead to disagreement. It's a spectrum, right? So, depending on how we were socialized to conflict, disagreement, and difficult conversations, uh, we all will have a certain response when these intensities come up or disagreements come up. When these intensities or disagreements come up. And so now we let's layer that on top of personality preferences. Now there are a lot of different there's a lot of different assessments around personality tendencies, and I typically lean in towards the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, and that's the inventory that determines preference for extroversion versus introversion, that differentiates thinking versus feeling, that differentiates a sensor, someone who needs that sensory input versus an intuitor, someone who is more of a free someone who is more spontaneous as it relates to time, versus someone who has a very structured mindset when it comes to time. So this is the Myers-Briggs personality preference inventory that I typically pull from, and there are lots of them. There's Enneagram and there's DISC and there's Strengths Finders. There's so many, but I have more of my expertise inside of Myers-Briggs. So this is where I'll speak from. And I'll speak specifically from the perspective of introversion and extroversion and the preference of thinker versus feeler. So when we talk about how the introvert manages conflict, introverts are people who introverts are people who process inward. And so, um, as introverts, we tend to not say a whole lot until we process things so that when we do speak, we can speak very intentionally. Now, that can be a double edged sword because oftentimes introverts can get stuck in their head around conflict and can end up being conflict avoiders depending on how they were socialized. And so when you're interacting with someone who is more of an when you're interacting in difficult conversations or disagreement or even in conflict with someone who's an introvert, they're more likely to be pulled in, they're more likely to be quiet, they're more likely to sometimes retreat inward before they'll speak outward. And they can have a tendency, and this is not a hard, fast rule, but they can have a tendency to need to come back after the initial conflict to process out their thoughts, their feelings, and their perspectives. And it's important for people who may not be introverts to understand this. So those who are more extroverted, extroverts tend to talk right off the top of their head. They process everything outwardly and externally. And that can be very overwhelming for an introvert who's more internal, who needs to go away, who needs to go get some space in order to think things through. Whereas an extrovert, they need to process in the now. They need to get it out. They need to they process outwardly, and remember they derive their energy from being with people as opposed to the introvert who derive their energy from being alone. And so a person who is an extrovert is more likely to want to settle it here, now, and out loud, and can sometimes be a little bit more assertive than the introvert. So, if you're an introvert dealing with an extrovert, it's important that you assert yourself, that you need to step away. And if you're an extrovert dealing with an introvert, you need to have some compassion and some understanding that the introvert needs to go away to process things and be willing to give that space. Okay, so now that's just a nutshell version, and there are many other ways and many other layers to the differences between the way introverts and extroverts deal with conflict. But I want to kind of pop over to the preference of thinker feeler because the there is a difference between how the thinker will approach difficult conversations and conflict and how the feeler will. Now, when we talk about thinker feeler, we're talking about how the brain processes relationship between people. And so the thinker is a person who is more fact-based, more logical. And in relationship with people, they're going to consider the facts before the relationship. That's not to say they don't consider the relationship at all, but they tend to consider the facts before the relationship when making decisions. All right. And the feeler, it's not about them being overly emotional or any of that nature, but the feeler will tend to consider the relationship in the conversation over the facts. That doesn't mean that they don't consider the facts, is that they value the relationship and they consider their values and the relationship and their what's important overall over simply the facts. Now, again, this is a spectrum, both the introversion and extroversion, there's a spectrum. Both the thinker to feeler is a spectrum of preference. And so what'll happen in difficult conversations is the thinker will just want the facts and consider the facts in the way they move forward inside of the conflict and difficult conversation or the disagreement. In order to resolve, it's all about the facts. Whereas the person who has a feel or preference, according to Myers-Briggs preferences, who tests that way, right? They will consider the facts, but they'll also consider the relationship and they'll want to preserve the relationship. Now, this could be challenging for the tested feeler because the feeler may tend to acquiesce more often to preserve the relationship. And especially if you have an especially if you have an introverted feeler, So someone who needs to process and who tends to value the big picture, or their values, or what's important overall, then they may tend to acquiesce more in a conflict or in a disagreement, which is not always a good thing. And so it's important for a person who tends toward logic to begin to practice considering what's important in addition to the facts, right? And it's important for the person who is more of a feeler preference, or who's more trying to preserve the relationship, to consider the facts. Because sometimes people who test on the side of feeler preference, who have a preference for preserving relationships, will overlook facts, i.e., overlook red flags, i.e., will not advocate for themselves, i.e., will not assert themselves to preserve the relationship. So if you are the type of person who tends to value what's important, or the relationship, or something of that nature when in difficult conversations, this would be your growth edge. And if you're a person who's like facts and only facts, and relationship be damned, then your growth edge is to begin to open your is to begin to open to what's important, and open to the value of the relationship itself. Okay. So now we've talked about these four dynamics: the introvert dynamic and the extrovert dynamic, the thinker dynamic versus the feeler dynamic. And there's a couple of other dynamics that we can talk about that perhaps I will bring into another episode. But I think it's important to consider these, and then consider, I talked about them in isolation, but these dynamics don't occur in isolation. They occur in concert. And so you might have an extrovert feeler, or you might have an extrovert thinker. You might have an introvert who's a feeler, or an introvert who's a thinker. And so if you have an introvert who's a thinker, they may be only considering the facts, but they may be considering them silently. And you might need to be pulling that out of them a little bit by asking questions and being curious about what's going on inside of their mind, as opposed to if you're an extrovert, just emoting and speaking and asserting what your views and your values are. Right. So it's important to understand the not only just the individual dynamics, but what happens when they're combined, layered on top of how we're socialized to conflict and difficult conversation and disagreements. And when we begin to have these awarenesses, it allows us to bring the space of listening in differently, which connects us, which is the ultimate goal, is to be connected, even in difficult conversations, even through conflict, is to be connected, and to move toward solution, even if that solution is to complete the relationship or to move on separately, but to move towards solution such that everyone feels complete in the interaction, and feels seen, heard, respected, and valued in the interaction. That's important. So I think when we pan out to the big picture, so I always like to pan out to the big picture in these conversations. What is the higher purpose of understanding these dynamics? It is really to be able to n- navigate with a bit of humanity and empathy in these conversations, so that we can move toward a solution that leaves people feeling whole and complete. All right. So now, if you found this valuable, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go out into your world. You're going to listen differently. You're going to be curious about the people you're speaking with, and you're going to share this episode with them so they have context for what you're talking about when you start to talk about thinking, feeling, introvert, extrovert. You're going to share this with them, and you're going to let me know how it goes. And how you do that is to comment on your favorite podcast platform, whether it's Apple, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Google Play, whether it's YouTube. Comment and let me know how it went, or what other um, tips that you have inside of this conversation that you've utilized. I always love to hear extra tips. Okay. So I appreciate all of my listeners, because without the listeners, there is no podcast. I want you to um, know that we are always listening for what you want. So if there's an episode around communication or beliefs or human behavior or mindset that you haven't heard in the context of leadership, relationship, parenting, or any other movement, and you want to hear about it, email me. Let me know. Dr. Maisha at drmaisha.com. And of course, if you are listening to this podcast and you're like, you know what? I might want to have her come speak on navigating difficult conversations and conflict. I do that. And so feel free to reach out to me on any of the podcast platforms. Excuse me. Feel free to reach out to me on any of the platforms with which you might be following me, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Substack, and I'm happy to interact with you and talk about. I'm happy to interact. I'm happy to speak with you about what your needs are. All right. So with that, go out and practice, 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 because it is the practice, it is the action that makes the difference. Let me know how it goes. Share this episode. Remember to subscribe. And until the next time we see each other, stay empowered.